Hello and welcome to the I Love Claims Virtual Building Claims Conference. Great to be with you. My name's Alan Suter. I'm the chair of I Love Claims Home. This conference has been a year in coming, and because of rather obvious reasons we weren't able to hold it physically. But over the last year we've held many webinars, and of course in October we took a sort of mini conference look at it virtually before arriving this week at the full virtual event. It's a very interesting year, but the original subjects still count, and perhaps have even become more relevant. So the four main things that we're going to look at over the 3 days are considering the construction backdrop and what effects that might have on building claims and their ability to repair. We're also going to explore data and information as how it might help the process and our planning. Clearly, one of the bigger issues over years is how the services are procured and managed, so we're going to take another look at that. And at the end of it all, it's the contractor who does the repair work and building claims, and we're going to take, if you like, a look at the contractor challenge. So, first of all, a big thanks to all of our sponsors and corporate partners. Our gold sponsors for this event are Accommodation Connect, AVIVA, the Claims Consortium Group, Sedgwick and Clearabee. And silver sponsors are Belfor UK, Corroventa, GeoBear and Safeline Environmental. And of course, we can't forget our long-term supporters, our corporate partners, who are Carpenters, Synergy, Innovation Group, iCab, CoreLogic and Sitecall. Very pleased to have them all on board. And it's only because of the support that all the sponsors and corporate partners give us that we're able to bring these events to you free of charge, and we're delighted to do so. And we will also look to be back with you physically later on in the year, the building conference, our normal conference, and hopefully our networking lunch as well. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with the stuff that we're going to explore over this coming week. So in today's session, we're going to take a look at the challenges on information and data. And this is a subject we visited in the previous webinars looking at buildings claims, and one that we'd really like to move forward. So we want to discover from our panel today, which I'm about to introduce you to, what's effective, how it should be helping the performance and process. And of course, we know there has been some improvement in that through the necessities that have arisen in the last year with the COVID-19. And maybe take a look at what's the difference between historic data, which certainly helps us, but can we get data more current, which can presumably help us mobilise and deal with it. Of course, there's a huge effect of underwriting as well. So I'm delighted to have with me today Laura Lazarus, who's from AVIVA, Matt Jackson from AXA, Tom Burroughs from Claims Consortium Group, and he's the real technical guy in there. Thought I'd differentiate between that. And from an innovation perspective, I've got the Innovation Manager of QBE, Lucy Costin. Glad to have you on. Three of you are sort of old hands at this. So Lucy, it's great to have somebody new on with them, and that might provoke some other further discussion into it. So let's turn the clock back to where we are just now. Where are we and where might we be going? So let me start with you, Laura. Where are we at the moment in terms of data and information, and where do you see it improving?
So I think we're probably coming towards a little bit of a crossroads, I suppose. So what we're really trying to do is be really clear on the outcomes that we're looking to achieve by looking at data. So I think, historically, we've asked for screeds and screeds of data and use bits of it and not others. So I think we're probably starting to have better conversations about the data that we want to see, and I guess better conversations around what we want to use it for. I guess part of that's to try and get buy-in really, and try and get people to work with us and challenge our thinking. Once they know what it is we're looking to see, actually what's the best way to provide it, rather than us kind of dictating, I suppose. We want 100 different things because we think that that's what we need to get to a particular answer. So I think we're starting to have better conversations around it. I think as we're having those conversations, we're still, in lots of areas looking at data in the way that we always have. So we get line by lines, and we feed it into management and insight teams, and we slice and dice as we have historically. But I definitely think we're starting to move forward and have better conversations, and actually people are starting to engage us a little bit more on those conversations and trying to help us a little bit more. So I think in summary, it probably feels a bit more collaborative than it has in the past, which is good, but probably still a long way to go, I think is probably where we're at.
Wouldn't disagree. I think that's fine. Matt, in looking at that though, we're talking about where are we. There's a difference here. Is where are we and where we would like to go to with what we know just now. But there's also where should we be. So should we be able to find data easier than having to go around everybody else and ask our suppliers for help? Or are we just nowhere near that state at the moment?
Hi everybody. Yeah, I think there's certainly a transition, Alan. I think if you look at the wider world at the moment, and it's interesting to hear the government making data a very much part of their decision-making process. Most of the analytics teams in and around our business feel that was our mantra for a long time. But data is clearly definitely important and will continue to be in terms of making key decisions. But I think collaboration has to still be the one of the main drivers. So I think as the suppliers, and as Laura referred to, a lot of the supply chain partners have a lot of that key information, and it's not just metrics as we've seen them before, but even advice and guidance. That's a source of data that is craved almost daily at the moment, whether it's regarding COVID impacts or indeed technical decisions on claims. So for me, we're all probably on different journeys, but it is still a journey and evolution of that position to make sure that we're masters of our own destiny in terms of having all that information at our fingertips, but in an open and sort of transparent environment where the supplier and the partners are just as important and just as key to the outcome and answers that we're after. So I think a transition, I think a bigger focus, if there could have been, from where we've been before, but not to be seen just in its traditional form as either benchmarking or cost saving or process milestone steps, but a whole bigger, richer source of information and data that we're all seeking to ultimately make better decisions. And Laura made the outcome point, and I think that's very, very much where we'd like to view it from. Try and understand what we're trying to see as the outcome, and then what data do we all have to try and get us to where we want to go.
Yeah, and I think that's two very common voices there saying the same thing. But Tom, how speedily can we get this data to people? So you're the tech guy. We get data, we can look at it. We know, and I'm sure many suppliers will tell us that's great, but the data we get that helps us the other way is a bit tough, which I'm sure both Laura and Matt would love to give all the suppliers the most up-to-date, best data they could, and trying to anticipate what's coming. So it's a two-way thing. How can we speed it up? How can we get accurate-ish data both ways in a much quicker way?
Morning, everyone. Hi. Yeah, I think it's interesting because just picking up on Matt and Laura, what you were saying, I think we've started to see that kind of that kind of change in dialogue around the data piece, and certainly more and more our clients and people that we work with more interested in it, having a different sort of dialogue around it now, and which is really helpful for us to understand what it is we need to capture, what's important, what's interesting, and what's not, because that sets us up in the right way to start with. I think in terms of the speed, it always requires investment, and it requires having businesses having people like me around to do this kind of work. But I think we can capture stuff pretty much as quickly as you want it, as a rule. I think the trick is about making sure we're getting the right pieces and we're asking the right questions at the right time, which I think we've talked about in these sessions before. Getting it available as quickly as possible. I think, technically speaking, it's not difficult, and it's the kind of stuff that we do quite a lot in terms of making data available real time and whenever you need it. There's a part that goes with that, I think, that's about that's about the relationship together and the transparency of that, and being willing to just be open. And as soon as you've collected something, from a site or from wherever it's been, making that available straight away. in the knowledge that it's a partnership together, and therefore if something starts to look a bit unusual or different to what you expect, well, that's okay, because the data is doing its job. It's there to tell us that something's happening. What's important is how you deal with it and how you react to it and how you respond and so on. So I think for personally, from my point of view, I think transparency is key here, because it should be about sharing everything that you're getting as quickly as possible, because that drives the right kind of behaviors in terms of knowing what's happening with that service and with that process. And if it's done with the right focus in mind, whether it's the outcome or whichever of those metrics are interesting or most important, that sort of feels like the way it should run and the way that sort of relationship should happen. And that's more and more the kind of thing that we see, more the kind of discussion that we see happening from a supply chain point of view.
Lucy, welcome to ILC forum, which is great to have you aboard. So from your perspective, in terms of data AI, what we can use and should be using, where do you think we currently are? And perhaps give us a view, a newcomer's view, where you think we might be heading.
I think previously the focus has been very much on reporting. It's been very much on reporting performance, dashboards, general sort of management information. As Laura and Matt have alluded to, making decisions about the supply base and about suppliers that maybe you need to tackle for underperformance, or those that you want to look at rewarding with more work or whatever for better performance. I think where we need to get to is much more around the processes that we're trying to improve for our customers and using data for that. So the management information, the dashboards, the regulatory reporting will always be there. We will always have to do that. We should always have to do that. It's good practice, and people need to be informed and transparent. But I think what my team looks to do and what we want to do at QBE is very much use data to inform us on how we can improve our processes, get the best claims journey for the customer and the best claims outcome. And a lot of that's around process and looking to, potentially automate things. You can't change processes confidently if you're doing it just on anecdotes. You need to have information, you need to have data, and you need quite a bit of it. Sample size is important, so you're not just focusing on something because of an outlier. But I think that's where we need to move to is less around collecting data just so we can look at it and say, okay, that's very interesting, to collecting data that has a purpose that we can use to then redesign what we do as a business for our customers. And that also then, we talk about claims, this is I Love Claims, but it must then feed back into underwriting in terms of better products for the customer and better underwriting, because, no one wants to be selling policies that are not right for the customer, and no one wants to be selling policies that are severely loss-making either. So there's a full circle to go through, but I think definitely focusing on using data for a purpose in terms of your claims journey and your processes is key to where we need to get to in the future.
It's an interesting view. Laura, I know you've said before that you had to, I think it was slightly more complicated to get good data and information in property claims than it had been in motor claims previously. Not necessarily for any reason other than it was. It must be. Are we seeing that improving? Because there's been certainly been an increased use of technology and stuff was forced upon us in the last year. Has that managed to result in the collection of any better data, or has it just been good camera stuff which managed to help the policyholder a bit?
Yeah, so I don't. It's not the collection or the collation of data that I think has been the issue historically in property claims. I think it's more the variance. So a motor claim. I guess that there's fewer variables. So I think the challenge is when we're looking at data and trying to use it, as Lucy says, to improve things for customers, to inform what we do at underwriting point, to understand that entire kind of end-to-end journey. I think there are just more variables in property claims that make drawing conclusions from the data more challenging. I think that the data is perhaps more disjointed. I would imagine that there's more suppliers involved in property claims potentially than there are in motor claims. So I think it's the stitching up of the data and joining it all together, and getting it into a fashion where we're making like for like comparisons, or we're looking at the same peril or the same type of claim. I think that's been the challenge. So I think we're definitely making inroads into that, but I think it does remain a challenge. I think one that we're keen to crack, though, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there are more complexities or stages of it, which technically makes the collection difficult. Yeah. Matt, what kind of information and data here? I'm going to give you the perfect scenario here. What can we use at the moment, and what other data do you think would help you design the process, help the suppliers control the costs, and serve the customer better, do all the things that we have to do? There must be data sitting there saying that we love this kind of data, and well, we might understand technically, well, it's difficult. Is it really that tough to collect?
Interesting thought, Alan. And I think in part of the answer, that's can be where some of the dangers will lie, because if someone in a procurement and supply chain sits there and writes his wish list, his or her wish list, someone like Tom perhaps would be sat on the other side of the table screwing his face up, thinking that's just, why do you need that? What do you need that for? And what are you trying to achieve? So I think without it sounding sort of crass, I think it has to be that joint conversation to begin with, to say, right, this is what we're thinking and what I'm trying to achieve. How can you help, and what data's there? I think it is complicated at times in property specifically, but not. I think we're through that cycle a little bit more from my perspective. The flexibility is there. I think overnight supply partners are able to add captures that we require. And I think that's what I would say to the dangers of that sort of approach. But equally, if you were to say to me in terms of the wish list, then the balanced scorecard would appear, and I would be saying, well, what's influencing driving the cost? What can help and improve customer, but equally what's causing dissatisfaction to the customers, and then trying to target the data that way. There's a chunk of performance management there that I think certainly in my seat we're getting to a new phase of, in terms of capacity planning, understanding pinch points in the process, and then being able to performance manage supplier partners or jointly with them performance manage their people. That can be individual contractors. Sorry, it can be individuals in that process, or indeed contractors. I think that's where it gets more powerful and more exciting, particularly when we then start to think how we overlay that for surge management. But yeah, asking somebody like me for that type of list, Alan, I think is possibly dangerous. And I think that's why that team approach with the supply chain coming hand in hand is where we truly make it effective for everybody. But it does require trust, because there are things that we would request to shoot for those outcomes. There are things that we would request that if you're not on that level with the supplier, I can imagine they would sit there and say, I can't provide that, or I'm uneasy with providing that. So yeah, I think that's where I'd go with that one.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a very interesting answer. Okay, Tom, Mr. Supplier, yeah, you ready for that? I mean, are suppliers, I'm not going to talk to you specifically, but are suppliers, or are many suppliers ready for that level of conversation? Because the bit that Matt added in at the end was really, are you at that level of capability and understanding to be able to engage in that way to supply the right information, which helps the whole process and everybody involved?
Absolutely, and I think you have to be. I think they have to be ready for that. And I think it's exactly right in terms of laying out a bunch of measures that need to be provided is perhaps a classical way of doing it, but it can drive the wrong outcome, or can maybe not support your outcome in the right way. So there's simple things like the measures of how long did it take to get the first person on site, and you've got to do it within this period of time. Well, if actually getting someone on site really quickly is not the right thing to do for that particular case, then it's not the right measure. And so it's two steps back. What's the important thing? What's the outcome? What do you want to achieve? Find the way of working the process that delivers that outcome, and then build the measures around it the other way around. So it's almost kind of looking at it back to front to some degree. I think, yeah, for us as suppliers, we have to be ready to take that on, particularly in this age of reporting and data and analytics and so on. We have to be ready to have that kind of conversation and have the tools and the kit to be able to deal with it. Because otherwise, trying to deliver on that transparency, trying to deliver on that process and optimize it is going to be really, really difficult. I think, Lucy, you mentioned earlier on about sort of designing processes and finding the gaps and the problems and the challenges within there. So, these are where some of the other techniques that we can start to think about these days can really help, like A/B testing, for example. I don't know which of these two processes is the right thing. I'm not quite sure what's the right thing to do, and I need data to tell me. So run both of them and compare it and try one out against the other. These kinds of things, I think, where if you've got the measures right, if we've understood the objective and the outcome in the right way, and you can now experiment and generate enough data to tell you, the data will tell you which one works best. So have the sort of the faith and the confidence and the trust to try it out and see what happens. Those are the sorts of places I think we'd like to see those conversations go and where we'd like to see that develop. Because if the measure is right, the data is king. It doesn't lie. It will tell you which one's working and which one isn't.
Okay, so let's ask Lucy about that one next. Does that mean that we're going to have to encourage all the people that, as an insurance company, we interact with in the claims process to be able to get sufficient kit that can allow them to interact with us better and provide us with better information? Because I think that, I'm not saying that's wrong, but that's going to be quite a tough task given the spread of supply chain that exists in property claims.
I think it's something that businesses need to be much more prepared to do. I've worked in insurance for about 10 years now, and it's always amazed me that there are some really very ancient practices that go on and mindsets sometimes. And I think, we do, all of us, everyone in the supply chain and the insurer needs to get used to the fact that now data is key, and businesses which have better access to data, richer data, are able to change more quickly. They're able to innovate more quickly. They're able to stay ahead of the game. If you're kind of floundering because you don't really know what's going on, then I think you've got to try and make those investments. There's things, you can get open source data on some things, but it's not the same as looking at your claims and what's going on with your customers and your own supply chain. So I think anyone that's thinking I don't know whether I should invest, maybe we'll just keep the same system that we've had for the last 20 years, maybe we'll just run things on spreadsheets. I would say, that thinking needs to change, even if it's just, basic changes, not expecting multi-million-pound IT upgrades. But I do think people need to get themselves more into that digital mindset, because customers want to interact in lots of different ways. Some want to phone, some want to email, some want to go through a portal, apps, whatever it might be. And I think we've got to be prepared for all of that, and the supply chain needs to be prepared as well. And I think insurers will be pushing their supply chains a lot over the next few years to become more digital and to share more relevant information with them.
That all sounds great. I agree. But what I do when I go back to my more practical days when I was running suppliers, insurance business, Laura, I'll throw this one at you first. When there was an event, a surge, we used to spend the time finding the information to supply to our client, to supply up the chain to find out what was going on. And if I'm really cynical, it would have been far more used to have the team concentrating on customers at that time. So I don't know if that exists. But Laura, are we in the place where the information flow is going to allow us to deal with surges and perhaps mobilise troops a bit easier with knowledge? Is that getting easier just now, or is it still tough to call the information and the progress of surge through to the insurer?
No, I definitely think that's getting easier, and we've definitely got better data. We've got better systems that allow us to interact with some of our supply chain. So I think some of that's definitely getting easier. I think though the key point I think Lucy just made there, I think the reality is we are in a more data focused world, and actually what that means is when we have events, or not even events anymore, just almost as business as usual, people are more keen to have data accessible to them very quickly, and not just the data, the insight and the story that sits with that data. So I think almost people's expectations are changing, and I think that is something that people need to consider. How can they work with insurers to be able to respond to those requests, not necessarily more quickly, but actually how do we get to a position where we're not having to ask for that stuff in the first place? How do we get to a position where people know what's important to us and the types of things that we need to know when there's a surge, and actually the data's in a position that it's really easily accessible, and really we're working close enough together that we don't have to necessarily ask the question or send out emails with lists of I need A, B, C, and D by 10 o'clock this morning, please. We've got to get better at having that kind of two-way interaction, particularly on when we are under pressure in times of surge, because really our key focus there is we just really want to know what's happening with our customers, right? And actually that doesn't feel like a particularly unreasonable ask. I think we just got to be clear on what it is we need and how we ask for it and how we share that between us.
But I think you make a very valid point there, because in any other market we would be sitting saying to people, well, you should know what your customers want. You should know what's important to your customer, and for a supplier and insurer, generally speaking, is the customers. I think that's a very interesting point in terms of breaking down we go forward. But looking on, we talk about, Matt, I've turned to you, we talk about historical data being able to help us plan. But if we could get real current data, would it help our mobilisation? So if all of a sudden there's a flood tomorrow in Manchester or Leeds, should we have enough data to know exactly where all of our resource is, how much we've got available, and we can mobilise really quickly? And if we should know that, how far away are we from really knowing that? Because we can talk about people's surge plans, but we know there's a lot of double counting and stuff in that between their customers. So how do we begin to move forward to getting that kind of data, which would help us respond so much better to surge events?
Yeah, so it's so I think in pockets, certainly from my perspective, we're there and we're close to a lot of our aspirations from previous events. But of course, there is still clearly going to be work to do, and I'm perhaps not talking for the entire market clearly, but I think I've said before on previous sort of events and discussions, I think there is a beauty in the surge process that we do find the next innovations, we do find the next process improvement, because that is where the industry is just at its best, in that real sort of panic mode. But I think the point that Laura's alluding to is that we need that reactive nature needs to become less and less, and I think by having that the list of things that we require plus the access, I mean, if it's in the supplier's system and they're capturing it, then ultimately in a data-driven world and via a data lake and or some other technical driven process, you should be able to draw upon it. So that hopefully does remove it. But you're always going to get the unknown. I mean, I can go back probably possibly longer than I would care to think or remember of certain surge events, but there were questions that we were just asked on. The hop caravans was a hot topic, I think, a decade ago. I've even recalled questions about can you tell me how many pets are in catteries and how many dogs are have been taken into sort of kennels, and they're just things that somebody at some point thought that was useful information to know about, either to drive a competitive advantage point or to improve the customer. And I think, but back to the point I'm clearly making as my thread in terms of that interaction and transparency, we have to be able to say, well, is that important? Why is it important? Explain that to the supplier, and then hopefully we come to the common point. I think proactive on that data. To answer your mobilisation question, that's where we know we can and should be better. We've got geo data, and I think Lucy mentioned around some of the open source stuff. We will be able to get that, work out where these events are hitting, and probably follow a theme that's pretty much common practice in America in terms of being able to deploy very quickly to those regions to have the most impact. And I think that's where you then start as an industry to cut down barriers in terms of it's not about access, performance, or any other insurer. It's about how the industry has responded. And I am being on the ground, and for some of those events in the past, you do see that it's no longer about that in one insurer's process. It's how we've all collectively responded, and in those scenarios, we're only as good as the weakest link, so to speak, and that's how the public and the consumers will view us. So data will be important. That real-time element to proactively respond and mobilise. I'm seeing evidence of that, but I think we've still, as an industry, got a little bit way to go.
And totally agree with it. The big point I really agreed with in there that we've thrown at a few people in our conferences over the years, where can insurers collaborate to improve performance and PR at a surge without impacting in any way on either their marketing or sales edge at all? So Tom, the challenge comes back. I've been a bit unfair. I've said, a lot of suppliers might struggle to get up to this, but of course, I did say we have this huge variance of suppliers in the home market. So if I turn back to, there are suppliers who can move forward and have people like yourself there to try and, how easy is it for you people who are investing properly in the technology supplier to be able to provide the sort of stuff that Matt and Laura and Lucy have been talking about?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily difficult. I think it's, there's always time and cost and so on that go into these things naturally. But I think, as we've said, at this point in time, at this point in our history, I think, if you're not prepared to do that, then or for whatever reason, I think there's some questions to ask. Maybe I think we have to put ourselves in a place where we can do it. I think technology, reporting systems, MI products, platforms, and so on are very, very commodity these days, and it doesn't really have to be that complicated or that difficult. It's just we sort of said it again earlier, back to the point about understanding exactly what it is you need to know. What's the key metric? What's the objective? What is it you need to get hold of? And just find a simple way of recording it accurately. Many sort of off-the-shelf systems, we use a bunch of stuff from Microsoft to help out with it. They're quite easy and openly accessible to help do those kinds of things. So I think, starting with that conversation with who your customers are, your clients, your insurers, your partners, your suppliers, whoever it is it might be, what are the things that you need to understand? What are the tools that are they're going to help you to get there? And as we start to move forward a little bit, I think some of the things that are kind of interesting and there's a sort of tech arm of our business that's just sort of coming together at the moment that we're starting to look at some of these things is around, are there kind of gaps in the understanding from the process from top to bottom? Because it's kind of one of those curious industries where a customer buys a product right at the very outset, and that comes with some rules and some limits and some other bits and bobs that go on with it. And at the other end of the shopping process, almost, there's somebody walking around a property with an iPad, sort of totting up the details of a loss or something that's happened. Is that information making its way all the way through that sales purchase, top to bottom? And is that product, the rules and everything being applied all the way top to bottom? Maybe, maybe not. We've got some views about what we can do with that. And then there's also another aspect of it where what previously would have been very, very difficult for suppliers like us to do has become increasingly commoditized, where we can perhaps start to think about getting answers out of information without actually having to ask questions. So some of those kind of machine learning, artificial intelligence, sentiment analysis type things are starting to be increasingly easy to get hold of. So rather than asking your customer, are they happy or not? Well, you know whether they're happy or not because of what they've said in the email they sent to you. And your sort of analytics will tell you if they're happy or not. Those kinds of things, I think, I'd like to see us as an industry getting into that kind of stuff now and actually maybe thinking less about the questions we ask and more about what else can I get out of the data that I've got. that's better than just kind of numbers and statistics. Maybe we can just derive a little bit more out of that, other sources that we might be able to bring into that, whether it's geographical or weather or whatever it might be. That feels like the kind of the next stage of it in terms of really trying to build a richer picture of what's happening.
Okay, so Lucy, does that encourage you to look at suppliers? Because the next question is, does it encourage you that we've got suppliers thinking like that? And actually, is the speed of this going to be driven more by suppliers of the sort that Tom's talking about there than it is by the insurers? Because I would imagine they would have the ability to develop the systems perhaps more quickly than a larger corporate organisation could.
I think speed of being able to develop things it can be quite subjective. I mean, yes, insurers might have more money, more cash behind them to be able to invest in IT systems, but we also quite often have lots of legacy IT, which make that quite difficult. And actually, sometimes a supplier that's small and agile and nimble can mobilize something a lot more quickly by just throwing a little bit of money at it, but they can adapt, they can change much more quickly than having a big juggernaut of an an insurance company trying to do it and go through all of those very heavily regulated governance control processes. So I think speed, actually suppliers are quite often better placed to do that more quickly. And a lot of the things that Tom was talking about, we're trying to do, and we're trying to adopt a kind of, try something out. If it doesn't work, just say, okay, it doesn't work, and move on from it quickly. Proof of concepts, run them very quickly, design sprints, work on something for a short period of time, use the data that you can get through it to make a decision about whether it's worth pursuing it as a bigger project. But absolutely, I think suppliers can get quicker to these things than we can a lot of the time. So it is about working together. And the other thing I would say is, particularly in building claims, suppliers are out there with the customer. They're right in front of the customer. We're at the end of the phone or at the end of an email, but the supplier is the person that's actually got, someone in that customer's property, working out what's gone wrong, working out how it needs to be fixed. So they are that end point, dealing with that customer. So they're key to getting the journey right, and getting the richness of data as well as the relationship side of things and the person interaction. Putting all of that together, I think, is what makes it work really well. But absolutely, I think suppliers can be just as quick, if not quicker, than insurance companies.
Okay, and it's fair. And Laura, I mean, the practicalities of this, it's great to think that we're going to be investing in getting stuff out quicker, but in the meantime, we still have to find ways of getting the information to the front end, getting the information to the back end, and making sure we're making the right decisions. So while we get everybody else in line, what are the steps that you can take just now to make sure that the information, and I know you're very strong in this, so the steps you can take just now that make sure you're getting the right information at the moment while we technically improve our ability to get proper data, decision-making data forward?
I think the key thing for me is just being, I'm going to repeat probably some of what I've already said, but I think it's just being clear on what it is that we're trying to achieve from the data that we're currently getting, and just being really clear what we need it for. So I think we've touched on this before, really we just want to know that you're looking after our customers, that our processes are working effectively, and we're not driving waste in anywhere we shouldn't be. That suppliers are looking after our checkbook, and that our suppliers are performing in line with how we'd expect them to. Lucy touched on this as well. There's some regulatory stuff, right, that we need to be able to evidence and show, but actually that's the easy stuff. I think the harder stuff, and the bit that we really need to work with people to get to, is the joining up of the circle. A bit like we've all touched on, I think, throughout this, that there's lots of really rich, meaningful and insightful information that you guys have on how the market's performing, on the types of claims that we're seeing, if things are changing, if things are getting more expensive, or I don't know, there's particular trends occurring. It's all of that stuff that we really need to be able to get to. And it's tricky sometimes because we don't always know what we're asking. I think that's why I like the focus on outcomes and being clear the types of things that we want to hear about, because actually more often than not, you guys are the experts, not or our supplier partners are the experts, not us. So if we can just be really, really clear on what we want to know about and what we want to see and hear about, I think it then makes it easier for people to have a think about the best way in which to tell us that. And it is really key. You know, the general insurance market is a competitive one, right? We're, you know, particularly in property, you know, you're pricing for policies that you might not pay a claim on for 6 or 9 months. So it's really key to us to understand what's going on, what insight our suppliers can give us, what's likely to change, and all of that sat there in data somewhere. We just need to keep having these conversations and working together in order to kind of tap into it more effectively than we are now. Because I guess that's why it feels probably to people like constant asks from insurers, because, you know, like Matt said, I don't know how many weird and wonderful questions I've sent people over the years for random information, but I think it's finding a way that that's all happening a little bit more naturally, without us feeling like we're asking, without suppliers feeling like they're having to go running off and hunting in all kinds of places to answer whatever random question an insurer might choose to ask them on that particular day, and just tying the whole piece back up, really. So I think there's definitely progress, I would say, but we've got to keep working on it, and the transparency point is really key, and the trust as well.
Okay, Matt, then does that in taking that forward while we wait for all the technical stuff to get ready, etc., and move forward, increasingly from something Laura said earlier, and certainly from feedback we listened to Lucy, it sounds to me as if part of the problem here is not that suppliers are going, which sometimes do, God, you're asking me for more information. Is this about actually saying, as we look to the future, the mindset of the supplier has to be the person pushing information forward, which shows how well they're performing, which shows how innovative they can be, which in the end, and we'll go into this in one of our later sessions of procurement, which in the end means we can provide better service. So that's keeping Laura's point happy about the regulators. We can provide better service for less of a cost, which keeps all the shareholders happy. So should this be being driven up the way, in the way Tom's talked about, rather than down the way?
So without, I'm going to sound very similar to Laura's answer on some of these things. So I'll try and add my personal take to it. But the two-way point, I'll have to come back, Alan. I think the supply chain partners are absolutely key in pushing that up. But then it's got to be answering the exam question. And the exam question for me will be things like, so how do we collectively prevent the next escape of water? There's a true partnership approach to a very, very interesting challenge. So firstly, what is going to be the next escape of water for us all from a market perspective, and then what can we collectively do, and what data do we need to try and address that challenge? So that will be things that suppliers can push up and clearly, if we can push down. And that's just one example that's probably indemnity spend driven, but clearly there are customer impacts on escape of water that we can then set each other. And the setting of those challenges has to be two-way as well, which apologies for that clear repetition on the relationship line. So I think there's that angle to not go totally into the sort of procurement decision. I think that clearly we can be better at articulating what we believe our minimum standards are in those processes. So articulating at tender stage what we're expecting from, what does data-driven interaction mean to us, and what's the level of requirements? There are most of the supply chain are on that journey, if not ahead at times. I think to probably endorse Lucy's comments around the position certainly large composite insurers are at, whether that's due to merger and acquisition sort of territories and taking on those legacies, or just simply in times of what's been important to the function and the building from an IT perspective. So the suppliers will be in, I'm not a technical person, but they will have lots of ways of sending and sharing data and pushing it into that type of environment we talked about, whether that's a central repository or or otherwise. And then from there, we can all draw and pull on that information, which perhaps stops some of the necessities for the suppliers to be sat there waiting for the request. We can serve ourselves, which is, again, is a common theme that I'm seeing in terms of, getting that data to a point and then businesses being able to draw upon it rather than this sort of the more traditional request. I need to know this. Can you tell me? I think it helps us all if we're the master of our own destiny on that data point. So, so I think it's a combination of that, Alan, and apologies again for reiterating that it's a two-way piece.
I think the thing is about all of these things that we're doing, reiteration is really important because it puts an emphasis on what we really need to think at and people that are listening to this think at going forward. So I'm going to come back and ask Tom a really awkward question now because it's fun. But Tom, the question is, do insurers, and Lucy kind of, I think, might have been sort of touching on it, do insurers have to become a little bit more flexible on their systems interaction or their ability to rely on some of the systems the suppliers might have to be able to move this forward?
Potentially. I think probably it's in some places it's about understanding the data journey and understanding, again, I won't repeat it, but understanding what you want your supplier to do, what role they play in the fulfillment there, what part of that journey are they responsible for, and therefore what kind of metrics are they being held to account on, and then if that piece is fairly clearly drawn out, and what the supplier needs in order to do their stuff is fed in well at the beginning, and how they're executing and feeding back is fed back nice and cleanly, then whichever systems are involved, the technicalities of sharing information between them is not normally too difficult with the with the right will in place. So I think if you kind of start from that point of view, everybody knows where they stand and what it is they need to achieve, what it is they need to do, and deliver it back in the right way. The fewer systems that are involved, obviously that makes it simpler because there's less sort of carting around of things. But it doesn't have to be that way necessarily. As long as everybody's kind of working to a common standard, that's the key thing. I guess from a supply chain point of view, and I'm just sort of going back to some of the other comments, the other bit that's interesting for us in terms of as a supplier industry, how we help our insurer clients out is about maximizing that information that we have and what we do with it, and how we can kind of tread that path between respecting the fact that we have a suite of customers who are all separate, and it's a competitive market that we all operate in. But inevitably, when a surge event happens or a COVID event happens, we learn quite a lot about what's happened in people's customer experience and what's been the impact on this event or so on and so on. So how in a sort of way that I think you talked about it earlier, Alan, in a way that respects the competitive nature of the market, sort of maximize on that sort of broader wealth of data that we've all been able to bring together in some way. I think that's another interesting one. So whether that comes from the point of view of benchmarking and what's the industry norm for how long it should take and how much it should cost to do one of these things, and is this new process that we come up with better or worse or no different, or so on and so on. Maybe that's the next stage that we'll get into as an industry. What could be done in that sort of way that works for everybody, respects the kind of competitive nature of the market and where we are, and kind of bring those pieces together. And likewise, that's a similar thing for us as suppliers, okay? Because we're all dealing with different parts of it. There may be 2 or 3 of us working together for one particular insurer. So it works at our end as well in some ways of how that comes together. Perhaps that'll be the next kind of the next piece to tackle.
So, last words to our newcomer, Lucy. Lucy, a couple of things there. First of all, is the flexibility in systems, which I think you did refer to being able to do, I would call it pilots and trials and stuff like that, which I think the insurance industry has not been great at in claims. I'm not saying they've not done it in the past. And is it also having systems that are flexible? If I'm a supplier, I want to be flexible enough because the values and advantages of all the insurers on this, they're all good insurers, but they might have slightly different sales things. They might have slightly different ways they want to treat with insurers. The culture with the customers might be slightly different. The message might be slightly different. And these nuances can be quite demanding for people who are trying to serve the market. So I guess two things: your systems need to be flexible and culture needs to be flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said earlier, it can be very difficult for any business to be flexible if you've got a lot of legacy systems, and if you're running on old versions of things, and to upgrade systems is hugely expensive. So sometimes you are quite constrained by that. I think flexibility is important. I mean, there's lots of ways you can do it. You know, some insurers actually ask suppliers to use the insurer system, and they will give them access. There's obviously a lot of GDPR and information security issues around that, but that does sometimes happen, and it can work quite well, because then it means that all of the data is on the insurer's system already. You also sometimes get, dual keying. So we might have a supplier that handles claims on their system, but then we have to ask them to dual key everything into ours, or we have to double key it into our system. That's not brilliant. That's obviously a lot of extra work for everybody, and adds a lot of cost and waste into the process. So you could look at perhaps API links between the systems to shoot that information between them. And that's potentially one way of doing it, is trying to build those links between different systems so that the data can be shared. I think, the old days of having multiple spreadsheets floating around, and password protecting them, or not, as I can remember in the kind of really old days, I think that's got to go. And I think, a lot of customers, end user customers would be amazed if that still happens. So, I think you have to look at other industries as well. So sometimes in insurance, I think we are guilty of just looking at insurance. But if you look at retail, if I think about, a high street shop, someone like, say, I don't know, John Lewis, but you can use an app to get to them, you can phone them, you can go on their website, you can email, there's lots of ways. If you've got a problem, you can get hold of people on Twitter, and this kind of way of thinking, we have to try and adopt that in insurance, because otherwise we're going to get seriously behind the times. And if we have a big event, a surge event like a massive flood, you'll have customers taking to Twitter within seconds and complaining that their insurer isn't doing enough. So I think we've got, flexibility is key. Being agile, being nimble, being quick to adapt is key. But I think just the mindset of thinking about, okay, well, what's this going to look like in 5 years, 10 years time? How do I, as a supplier, how do I make my business relevant for what is going to happen in the next 5 years? Because otherwise it's going to get increasingly difficult. And insurers are going to put customers more and more and more at the heart of what they're doing. So yeah, I would say a lot of it is about the mindset.
It is. Thank you very much. I mean, for all the suppliers who've joined in early to have a look at the procurement and management side, I think a lot of that's still relevant in that as well. So Lucy, Laura, Matt and Tom, thanks very much. It's been great talking to you. Thanks for listening to this session from the I Love Claims Building Claims Conference. We hope you've enjoyed it. Big thanks again to our gold sponsors, Accommodation Connect, A3, Claims Consortium Group, Sedgwick and Clearbay. To silver sponsors, Belfry UK, Corriventa, GeoBear and Safeline Environmental. And of course, to our corporate partners, Carpenters, Innovation Group, Synergy, iCab, CoreLogic and Sitecom. Any questions you have, please just drop me a note at alan@iloveclaims.com, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.